This is Frederickson and Byron's Return to Work Blueprint webinar. And today you've got me, Teresa Thompson, Ann Radolinski, Kristin LeBre, Bev Adams, and Bridget Penick here to walk you through return to work best practices. We will be addressing both Minnesota, Iowa, North Dakota, and national items today. A lot of the initial overview will be applicable to people in all states, but there will be some Minnesota, Iowa, and North Dakota specific items that we'll address as well. The final portion of today's webinar will be a Q&A session, and we're not going to address any questions until that time. To submit questions, please send them in the Q&A box up on your screen, which you should be able to access through the Q&A button, and that's actually down on the bottom of your screen. We've enabled the upvoting feature, and that means you can like questions submitted by other listeners so that we can tell which questions are the most popular. We'll do our best to address as many questions as we can, and we did have some pre-submitted questions, and we will also try to answer some of those. We are recording today's program, and you'll receive an email once the recording has been posted online. So if you're joining us live today, you'll also receive information on continuing education that we can have available. All right, so let's get going. So our agenda today, we are going to walk through business needs and employee selection for return to work. Then we'll turn to preparing and creating your preparedness plan, walking through communication and training for your employees. And then we've got a separate section just on health screening because we know how important that piece actually is for all of you. We'll then turn to anticipated and unanticipated employment issues that you should expect upon return to work, and then turn directly to the Iowa and North Dakota issues. As I stated, we will be ending with North Dakota issues. And at this point, I am going to turn over the controls to Ann.
Good morning, everyone. We are so pleased to be with you this morning, and we look forward to the time, hopefully in the near future, when we'll be able to greet you in person. The pandemic we are in, of course, is not over. We have many challenges to come. However, an increasing number of employers are ready and will be ready in the next weeks to start calling furloughed folks back to work. This is much needed news for all of our ears. The last 2 months have seemed like an eternity to many of us, and we've started to wonder, will we ever see the other side of this crisis? So how best to move forward toward bringing employees back in a way that both achieves business purposes and objectives and is in compliance with the various federal, state, and local employment laws? As Teresa has indicated, we've divided the return to work topic into discrete segments today. The first segment, which I will cover, focuses on the initial overreaching question, really the first step in the process in many ways. How do we evaluate and select who or which portion of the furloughed employees to call back to work? All decisions, of course, start with evaluation of business needs. And in fact, the return to work process is first and foremost driven by business decisions. And the reality is that if our return to work evaluation and selection process is challenged down the road based on, for instance, discrimination grounds or other grounds, we will in fact defend that evaluation and selection process largely on the legitimate business reasons that prompted and supported our decisions made with respect to which employees come back, which are left on furlough, and which are ultimately terminated. Thus, actually understanding the business needs and making the business case the basis for our actions is important, not only for the success of the business, but also for purposes of minimizing legal risk. So what are some of the questions from a business perspective? What are the areas of the business that will be up and running and on what level? What will the business look like now? Or what does it look like now as opposed to where we were in February. Business levels are likely to change in many directions in the weeks and months ahead, and do we need to be flexible in employee counts and hours? What is the timing of returning to work for the various segments of our business? Is it going to be a phased opening? Are we rolling out a full-scale opening? What are the areas of our business that we're allowed to open, employees that we're allowed to bring back under the current state of executive orders in the states in which we operate? And what is possible and practical from a financial perspective? Can we bring back employees at their original rates of compensation? Does compensation or benefits need to be adjusted? Do hours, shifts need to change? Is there a need for reorganization of positions, roles, and responsibilities? What is our situation? Once the business needs are determined, including the employee count and the positions that will be brought back, how can we best evaluate and select what employees will be brought back? Many of our clients are very familiar with this process from the perspective of implementing, for instance, a reduction in force or a reorganization that results in terminations, demotions, compensation changes, etc. We advise clients at the forefront to determine selection criteria, apply those selection criteria equitably across the workforce segments, and ultimately evaluate, ideally in conjunction with counsel to keep it under privilege, attorney-client privilege, whether the selection criteria used inadvertently results in some kind of potential discrimination or other risk. So in this vein, when calling employees back to work, where we are doing a less than full callback, what criteria will we use? Well, we have many options. However, we start with what were the employees told when they went out on furlough? Go back to the documentation and your notes of communications with the employees. Were they, in fact, for instance, told that we would return people to work based on length of service? If so, and we want to now do something different, you'll want to work with legal counsel to determine how best to do so to minimize the risk. If we didn't make any promises to employees as to how we were going to handle return to work, what criteria do we have available to use? Well, many. A few examples. The least risky way is often to call folks back in order of lengths of service. The longest serving employees first until we have the total workforce needed from a business perspective. This, of course, is often not the most desirable approach because it may or may not result in ensuring that key talent necessary to the success of the business is returned to work. Another approach would be to reach out to furloughed employees in a formal way, communicate the positions available, and allow folks to volunteer and indicate their availability for position openings. The company would then presumably develop criteria to select from this pool of employees as to who would be called back. This approach has some inherent administrative burdens and issues, but it is an approach that could be considered. Another more common approach, though, is to make the selection based on, of course, business needs, but based on performance and skills of the individuals, and perhaps combined with length of service. In choosing these criteria, it is important to evaluate how we're going to determine performance and skill, and whether there's documentation supporting our ultimate selection of the employees that are called back as opposed to those who are left on furlough or terminated. Once the selection is made, the employee data, ideally again under attorney-client privilege, should be evaluated for risk factors. So you look at, for instance, who was selected for callback in terms of sex, race, age, disability, et cetera, as compared to those folks that were left on furlough or who were ultimately terminated. You also look at such things, other risk factors, such as have any of the folks who have been left on furlough or who have been selected for termination, have any of those folks in recent months engaged in, for instance, protected activities such as making a formal or informal complaint of discrimination or harassment, or engaging in whistleblower activity, et cetera, or any pregnant, et cetera. Similar risk assessments would be made with respect to compensation decisions and decisions with respect to hours, schedules, position changes, and other terms of employment for those that are returning to work. Once the selection has been made and the risk factors have been identified and addressed to the company's satisfaction, you may choose to reach out initially to the selected employees by phone, but ultimately we do recommend, for a whole host of reasons, in particular due to the specific legal requirements and best practices in our current coronavirus environment, that the return to work offer details be set forth in writing. Of course, communication should also be developed to update and inform employees who remain on furlough status of their continued status, and of course to those employees where employment is being terminated if applicable. With these comments, I will turn the presentation over to my colleague, Teresa Thompson, who will talk about some of the work preparedness plans and processes and employee communications regarding those plans and processes.
All right, thank you very much, Anne, and thank you for that background on how to evaluate and select employees to return to work. That is obviously one of the first steps that you need to make as you're thinking about who to bring back to work. The other step that you really need to think about is, what are you going to do to prepare your workplace, your employees for that return to work? And our states have given us some guidelines on how to do that, and we're going to walk you through some of those. So first, and this applies no matter what state that you are in, you create a preparedness plan. And what I mean by that is it is actually a written document that you bring together your stakeholders, the key stakeholders, whether it's legal, HR, security, safety, all of those people who, operations, all of those people who will have a say in your plan to return to work. And you create this document to outline some key areas. The first is the workplace plan. What are you going to need to do to make your workspaces safe for people to come back into the workplace and to meet social distancing and other hygiene guidelines? What employee policies and trainings do you need to do before those employees can come back to work? What we have found is that many of the policies in place prior to the COVID-19 pandemic are really out of date now as to how you can address employee safety in the workplace, and those policies should be reviewed now. From an employee safety standpoint, you want to consider in advance what PPEs are you going to provide to employees, what hygiene processes you're going to put into place into the workplace. And all of these things should be communicated to the employees before they return to work. You should also determine what you are going to do when and if, and it's more of a when, you are going to get a confirmed or suspected COVID-19 employee exposure in the workplace. So all of those things should be done in advance, and I'm going to walk you through the details of all of those. In Minnesota, in particular, you are actually required to have some key components in that preparedness plan, and the government has done a very nice job preparing a template that you can actually use for purposes of preparing this plan that walks you through these things. The first thing that we get a lot of questions on, and still seems to be creating some uncertainty, is the idea that employees who can work from home must continue to work from home under the current executive order, at least here in Minnesota. Many employees have been asking, do I need to go back to work? And employers are saying, can't we force employees to go back to work? And the idea is that if they can work from home, they still must work from home. You must also have a plan in place to increase social distancing in the workplace, a plan about how to address sick workers and ensure that they stay from home and implement appropriate health screening protocols. You must address personal hygiene and source control and what you expect from your employees and your management in regards to addressing personal hygiene and source control. You need cleaning and disinfectant protocols in place. And you also need customer controls and protections. And this last one came in place after the governor in Minnesota opened up a few more additional businesses with the last executive order. And I'm not going to address a lot of those details later, but the key thing there is that certain retail businesses were permitted to open, but only to pre-order goods and pre-arrange to have certain services provided. Customers are still not permitted to enter those business premises. And so it's really a matter of determining appropriate drop-off and pickup and delivery protocols and ensuring that employees who are engaging with customers are wearing appropriate PPEs. So let's dig into the pieces a little bit more. The policies and protocols are actually a piece that I think my clients anyways are really a little bit worried about, because it's a lot of work for HR professionals in particular to determine how they can revise and supplement and craft new policies for all of these different areas. Some of the key ones that we see coming out of this are key policies for determining employee hygiene, disinfecting, and cleaning. And what you can do here is you can post notices around your workplace that relate to your expectations regarding hygiene, whether that means that they must regularly wash their hands, that they must be using appropriate hand sanitizers, whether you've decided if they are going to use non-medical cloth masks, whether you want them to use gloves in the workplace. You can post those things and also create the policy relating to what your expectations are for hygiene, disinfecting, and cleaning. The second one that is very difficult at this point in time is that the typical sick leave policies that employers have in place are not really appropriate for today's environment. In the past, the idea was that if you were sick, really sick, you should stay home. But there was always a feeling that there could be some type of performance or attendance issues if you did stay home, if somebody didn't believe that you were actually sick. Those policies should be amended to make clear that if employees are suffering from any of the key symptoms of COVID-19, or if there's any question if they've been exposed to an individual experiencing those symptoms, that they must stay home and that they should not come into the workplace. And they should know that they won't be penalized in order to do that. Those policies also have to address how to ensure that you are providing reporting mechanisms for when the individuals are sick. They should be given the guidance in advance and likely in their return to work letter that Ann mentioned, that these are the things they need to think about before reporting back to work, which means they haven't experienced any of the key symptoms of COVID-19, they haven't been exposed, they haven't been traveling. All of those things the employees need to think about and know that they're required to think about before reporting back to work. Kristin's going to walk you through the health screening, so I'm not going to talk any more about that now. You also need to think about a guest and visitor and customer control policy. I've had a number of clients asking questions about what they can do to protect their employees from guests and visitors. This also relates to creating a process in place if your employees have to go to a customer site. There are a lot of concerns regarding employees going into customer or client sites and those customers and clients not having appropriate controls in place. In those instances, I recommend that you think about creating a questionnaire for your customers and clients that you can actually ask in advance of the scheduling of that site visit to ensure that you can show that you are protecting your employees and that you are asking about and being able to reassure your client or your customer or your employee. The other question that we're getting a lot of is the PPE requirements or just the PPE requests that you might be getting from your employees and what you as an employer feel you must do in order to keep your employees safe. There are a lot of questions regarding whether or not to use face masks, non-medical face masks in the workplace. And in fact, the state of Minnesota strongly encourages the use of face masks in the workplace. One of the things to think about there is that if an employee is sitting in a closed office or in an office space where they are more than 6 feet away from others, that perhaps in those instances, they don't always need to wear the face mask. But if they are walking around in common areas, they absolutely should be wearing face masks because they are interacting more closely with others. But determining what those PPE requirements are and what you as an employer are going to require should be done in advance and communicated to the employees. You should review your accommodation policies as well as your sick leave policies to ensure that you are both accommodating any type of disabling condition as a result of COVID-19 or exposure to COVID-19. And you should also be ensuring that you are complying with any new sick leave laws or the FFCRA. Finally, you should ensure that you have complaint procedures in place. And this relates both to customer sites. If an employee is required to go to a customer site and does not feel safe because of what they are seeing there, they should have a mechanism to report that, and also a mechanism for reporting other employees who are not following policies. And I know that these are a lot of things to put in place before you bring employees back to the workplace, but if you do and you notify your employees about this, it will make things easier in the long run. You also have to think about what your workplace is going to look like. It is not going to look the same as it did. We are not simply going to be able to go back into the workplace and expect everything to be exactly the same. For example, how are you going to conduct your meetings? Will you continue to do your meetings by Zoom, or will you actually permit face-to-face meetings? And can you actually conduct face-to-face meetings if you are not, if you cannot maintain appropriate social distancing? And the answer there is you should not if you cannot maintain proper distancing. What are your social spaces going to look like? Your cafeteria, your office areas, your hallways, your elevators, your meeting rooms, all of those things you're going to need to reconfigure in order to ensure proper social distancing. You should work with your building to ensure that you have a plan in place for use of elevators. For example, how many individuals will you permit in an elevator at one time to ensure proper distancing? Again, this should be implemented before any employees come back into the workplace. You may also want to consider different schedules, whether you schedule additional shifts or whether you stagger shifts in order to ensure that you have the appropriate number of employees in the workplace at the same time. The last thing, obviously, is the use of masks in those common areas as well. You should consider in all of this that if there are some workers who can continue to work remotely, that you permit them to continue to work remotely. Finally, work on a communication plan for your employees. Anne mentioned this a little bit about the need to be able to provide a letter to your returning employees about the expectations, about the plan for the return to work. And in that communication, you should be providing all of your new and revised policies. You should be providing all of the safety guidance for the return to work. And you will need to, in that letter, arrange for appropriate training, at least in Minnesota. Under the current guidance from the executive order, you must provide training on your COVID preparedness plan before employees return to work. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And you want to, again, in this letter about returning to work, provide clear expectations for when employees should not come in. And I would recommend that you include in that letter what are those symptoms, if they are experiencing, that they should absolutely not return to the workplace, and the contact person that they should contact if they have any of those symptoms or if they've been exposed to anybody with those symptoms, so they know that they need to postpone their return to work. Finally, the last component of the preparedness plan is conducting the training. In Minnesota, they actually need to be trained on each aspect of your COVID preparedness plan: the sick and stay-at-home protocols, the social distancing, the hygiene, and the customer controls. And some clients have asked, how can this training be done? I think about this in the sense of being able to do a webinar or a Zoom call prior to the return to work, walking through your employees on how they can meet and exceed those expectations. You can provide written training materials, although as many of you know, having some kind of live interaction is always better. Provide an opportunity for employees to ask questions. And there are also online training protocols that can be created that you can have employees take before they come back to the workplace. The last thing that you should ensure that you do, particularly to meet any CDC guidelines, is to ensure they know how to put on and take off and dispose of their PPEs. So that's all I have for the preparedness plan. And now I am going to turn it over to Kristin LeBre to talk to you a little bit more about the health screenings. Kristin?
Good morning, everybody. This is a big topic, and I'm going to try to go through it very quickly. We've looked at your questions, and hopefully this will address some of them. And then at the end, if there are additional questions on health screenings, we will hopefully have time to answer them. So in Minnesota, the Governor's Return to Work Order 2040 requires planning and providing a safe work environment. And as Teresa mentioned, the Return to Work Plan must include health screening policies and procedures to keep sick employees out of the workplace. And I know a number of you have asked, does the health screening requirement apply to critical businesses also? And 2040 was not explicit about that, but there was some commentary issued that said that the intent of the critical business order was that those critical businesses would operate in accordance with OSHA, Department of Health, CDC guidelines. So I think the most conservative approach would be to say that yes, the intent was that critical businesses would have to also follow the Return to Work Preparedness Plan requirements. So moving on, the first thing I think you should do is develop a screening plan or policy. And the policy or plan should contain who should stay home, what are the characteristics or symptoms of an employee who should stay home, who will be screened, what type of screening will be done, when and where the screening will take place, who will conduct the screening, and what to do with the results. So I'm going to talk about each one of these pretty quickly. So the Governor's Order 2040 said that all employees who return to the workplace, as well as owners, contractors, vendors, volunteers, and interns, should be screened. The best practice is to inform all of those groups of what the policy and procedure will be before they return or enter the workplace again. Obviously, employees who are working from home would not be screened. Which screening tool should be used? This could be a long discussion, but there are several options. The Governor's Order doesn't say which health screening tool to use, but there are different ways that you can do the screening. One option is a written questionnaire presented to employees when they enter the workplace and asking them about CDC or Department of Health identified symptoms and risk factors. And the Department of Health does have a list of those, as does the CDC. So you could prepare a questionnaire based on acceptable questions. And the EEOC has approved that kind of questioning. Temperature taking is now expressly permitted during the pandemic by the EEOC guidelines. And there may be future options that become available. There was just an antibody test approved by the FDA, but I think it's going to take some time for that to become an option for employers. So I think right now the written questionnaire or the temperature taking are the primary options. How do you decide what screening tool should be used? There's a lot of considerations here, and I think I didn't list them all, but the number of employees, what is an accurate tool, ease of administering the screening, how it's going to be reported. Confidentiality is a very big one, and the safety of both the employees and who's ever administering the program is important. As we all know, temperatures themselves may not indicate COVID, and these screening tools are not perfect, but I think the goal is to do what you can to ensure a safe workplace, and doing health screening is something that was specifically identified as something that should be done. When and where should the screening be performed? I know that Target and Home Depot are having employees take temperatures at home. I'm not sure how they're being reported or whether they're reporting to to their supervisor when they get in the workplace. But, there is some gray area about if this is done at home, does the employee need to be paid for that time? So that's one potential question with that issue. If the employee reports to work, you'd like to stop the source before it gets into work. So you'd like them to be tested or screened before they enter the workplace and clock in. Ways to prevent lines and that sort of thing would be to stagger shifts, add different shifts. One idea that's been proposed is to have employees wait in the car and text when they arrive and have them come in. Again, I think a lot of logistics will depend on how many employees you have and can you keep the employees separated from one another. And the pay obviously enters into it. How long is it going to take to administer these checks? Really important on this is it's got to be done privately. So an employee should not be, tested in front of other employees. They shouldn't be able to overhear confidential conversations about health information. You should have a plan that if an employee does test, have a fever, that you will know how you will handle that employee should they be referred to someone waiting that will then guide them out of the workplace. I realize also that there may be union issues associated with which screening tool you pick and how it's handled. There could be things in a collective bargaining agreement or in past practice that may impact how you conduct the screening. Another issue is who will conduct the screening, and that would be, are you going to have a third-party health provider come on site? Do you employ a nurse, or are you going to train a supervisor to conduct the testing, either a questionnaire or administer a temperature? If a supervisor or an executive or someone else is going to conduct the temperature taking, then you need to seek input from a health professional and make sure that anyone who is conducting the taking the temperatures, that they be trained and they know how to do it properly so that the results are accurate. And another very important consideration is safety. If you were going to have your own employees administer the test, then you want to make sure that you are providing PPE if the test requires them to be within a close distance of the employee. So that would be a mask, perhaps head or eye protection, head protection, and gowns if they are going to be very close to the employees. If you're having a third party administer the testing, I would recommend that you have obviously a contract with that third party, and you make sure that the third party will conduct all the testing in accordance with appropriate laws. Very important consideration is what you do with the results. The employee health information must be kept confidential, and per the Americans with Disabilities Act, it needs to be kept in a separate file that is apart from the personnel file. That would apply, if there is a log of temperature taking and you can identify an employee by looking at that log should also be kept confidential and secure. And it's important to do, to make sure that employees understand what will happen as a result of the results. So you want to tell them what symptoms or answers are going to result in an employee not being permitted to work, and what happens if an employee refuses to participate in the test. Those are two things that should be addressed. As far as symptoms, it's important to monitor the recent guidance of CDC and the Minnesota Department of Health. As you may be aware, new symptoms of COVID have come to light, and the CDC ended up updating their symptoms. So it's important to monitor the guidance on a constant basis. It's important to administer rules uniformly. You want to make sure that if someone has a temperature, over 100 or 100.4, if that's the rule, then you need to make sure that every employee who tests that way is treated the same and not treated differently. And then, of course, keeping in mind that if somebody does end up being sent home, you need to keep the other laws, paid sick leave laws, in mind if someone is out of work due to COVID. Other key takeaways, this is very important, I think, and I'm recommending that people or employers have someone designated at their workplace to monitor guidance from health authorities. There's lots of good information out there on the various websites, and it's important that someone is monitoring that guidance to make sure that whatever policies and procedures you have in place are consistent with what's been recommended. As I mentioned, testing is evolving, but you want to make sure that any test that you use is FDA approved, and EEOC has said that any testing that's administered must be reliable and accurate. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ann Radolinski, who's going to talk about unanticipated and anticipated employee issues.
Hello again. What are some of the issues we are seeing and that we expect to see as employees are called back to work? Switching gears a little bit for our third segment of the talk here. I will, excuse me, I will outline a number of the key issues that are surfacing and likely to surface. We're hearing from clients that there are continuing challenges in the category of what I would call availability. Employees are raising fear-based concerns, for instance, in terms of returning to work. They're raising concerns about returning to work because of their own health issues or disabilities, or they're raising concerns about returning to work because of the health or disability of family members. Others are expressing that they wish to remain at home and just collect unemployment because they are receiving more in unemployment, they say, than they would be in their jobs or for other reasons. How do we approach these issues? This will, of course, depend on the circumstances, but I will outline a few fundamental principles for approaching these types of situations. In terms of the fear-based concerns, we're hearing a lot of these issues surfacing. If you determine that this is indeed the only reason the individual is not wanting to return to work, if the person can do their job from home, you may be required, depending on the state, including Minnesota, to allow them to do so under the applicable executive orders or other law. If the person from a business perspective cannot work from home, it is really, I think, a matter of communication, meaning talk to the employee, explain the business need for them to be at work. Talk to the employee about the steps the employee has taken, the company has taken, and will take with respect to health and safety in the workplace. You know, if there's a preparedness plan in place, have that in front of you as you talk to the employee. And encourage the employee to return to work, because that's really what you want to have happen. Ultimately, though, if the employee chooses not to return, this is, of course, their choice. It's the employee's choice. But the employer, in most circumstances, is going to be able to deem this as a voluntary resignation. I would advise that you work with counsel on these situations, particularly with regard to the ultimate communication to the employee of your decision, as there may be nuances to the situation that could change the approach. Similarly, if employees have indicated they cannot return to work because of their own health situation or disability, or because of the health situation or disability of family members for whom they are providing care, for instance, you would essentially approach this as you would normally, even outside of this coronavirus environment in which we find ourselves. You would determine if there's a federal, state, or local leave, depending on the state in which the employee is based, which entitles them to a leave, paid or unpaid in these circumstances. That's on the federal level, the Families First Act comes to mind, the traditional family and medical leave, et cetera. If so, if these apply, if the Leave Act applies, you proceed with the appropriate documentation and grant the leave. You would also consider whether the person has available PTO or sick time that can be used for the absence, or whether they have the ability to request a leave under the circumstances under company policy, and accordingly allow them to use the accrued and unused PTO or sick time and or process their request for the leave. But if the individual is not eligible for statutory leave, has exhausted PTO or sick time, if any was available, and is not entitled to leave under company policies, you move to an evaluation of whether there is a reasonable accommodation that needs to be made under the Americans with Disabilities Act on a federal level, or the typically parallel state or local law, depending on the circumstances. If the individual is not entitled to leave under statute and it is not a circumstance where the Americans with Disabilities Act or a state human rights law would require a reasonable accommodation to be followed, you follow much the same process as I indicated above. If the person can do their job from home, you may be required, depending on the state, to allow them to do so under applicable executive orders. If the person from a business perspective cannot work from home, it becomes a matter of communication with the employee. Talk to them about the business needs, talk to them about the health and safety protocols that are in place, and encourage them to return to work. And ultimately, if they choose not to, again, this may be a circumstance where we can communicate to the employee that this is a voluntary resignation. I carefully caution you that every situation is going to have its nuances. So I'm laying out some fundamental principles, but the devil, of course, is in the details. In terms of unemployment compensation, I want to stay home because I want to, for whatever personal reason, stay home and collect unemployment. This is where that return to work offer being in writing is incredibly important, in addition to all of the other reasons that you've heard from Kristin and Teresa this morning. You would indicate, ultimately, if the employee chooses to stay home because they want to collect unemployment, that you are considering it a voluntary resignation from employment. Again, I would seek legal counsel as to the specifics of the case, as there may be nuances that would warrant a different approach. So what are some of the additional issues that we can expect our clients will face as employees return to work, to the extent we have a crystal ball? We expect that there will be challenges in terms of employee adaptation and adherence to the new workplace environment, policies and protocols. This is a huge change for everyone. We also expect to continue to see employee leave requests and accommodation requests due to mental and physical health issues of the employee and family members. This is a difficult time for everyone for any number of reasons. We expect that fear concerns, personal health concerns, family concerns, and adaptation challenges will continue in this new work environment, and the demands will be ongoing, and we are going to have to address each of those employee issues as they arise. All of us, I think, are going to be very, very busy for the months to come. As I've outlined, there are frameworks for analyzing approaches and solutions to these issues, of course, and there's always a way forward. But the devils of each circumstance are in the details, and we urge you, as you come across situations that are challenging, to reach out to your legal counsel. Certainly any member of our team could help. In terms of adaptation and adherence to the new workplace environment, policies and protocols, Teresa's comments and Kristin's comments particularly bring this to mind. We can expect to face issues with employee resistance to the protocols or failure to comply with the protocols and policies, such as some of the details of the preparedness plans, the health screening, not following social distancing. We can expect complaints by employees against other employees that will need to be investigated and addressed, and we will ultimately have to deal with many of these failures as performance issues and follow the company's protocols for warning, coaching, discipline, and if necessary, discharge. We also, as both Teresa and Kristin noted, can expect to have continuing directives. This is a moving target from the CDC, the state departments of health, and federal and local governments, which will force us to make additional adjustment to these protocols and processes. The need for flexibility is probably the only constant in the times ahead, unfortunately. We are planning on scheduling a future webinar addressing in more detail the employee performance, adaptions, mental health, and physical health issues, challenges that our clients are facing and will face with employees as they come back to work. With these comments, I will turn the discussion to my colleague, Bridget Penick, to discuss developments in Iowa.
Thank you, Anne. And for all of the Iowa attendees on the call, I'm not alone in saying I'm glad I'm not working in Minnesota right now. Nothing you have heard thus far under the Minnesota requirements obviously are required in Iowa, but none of them are prohibited either. And so we may or may not go down a similar path in our state, and I think all of that is useful information and practical information to implement here as we are adjusting to whatever this new normal is. And I wholeheartedly agree that the normal is going to be new. And it's not going to be a one-shot attempt. I think things are going to continue to evolve. So what is the current status in Iowa? Let me see if I can. There we go. Iowa was relatively early in identifying the disaster proclamations. From March 9th through just this week, May 6th, Governor Reynolds has issued 14 proclamations. We kept waiting, some of you did as well, for the shelter-in-place order, but nothing that stringent has ever been implemented. Iowans are encouraged to stay home. The governor continues to speak at her daily press conferences. They're usually at 11 o'clock. So if anyone has tuned in today and there's any breaking news, I'm sure we'll hear about it after this webinar. The mantra is, we trust Iowans to do the right thing, stay home if you're sick. We leave decisions to individuals and to businesses. We know today that as of the proclamation from Wednesday, many additional businesses were opened up across the state. And some of my dental clients, for example, were surprised to get that news via the news conference. So everyone is scrambling a bit, and it's almost harder without specific requirements to know where to draw the line, what to implement, and how to get back to work. And so I think that, you know, the case-by-case analysis and application is really where things are right now. On the slide, I want to make sure we understand that the emergency proclamations are set to expire May 27th, but the current closures and temporary business limitations, all of them are only in place until next Friday, May 15th. And so stay tuned. There's certainly going to be something coming next week at some point to see what happens with those additional business changes. And so many of you I know, just like our office, have been playing a wait-and-see approach here. Some people making their best efforts to work from home where you can, and that seems to be something that works well in several industries and then simply doesn't work in others. And I know some of you have a mixed a bag of workforce, key workers maybe in your facilities or offices and others at home, and are now reaching out to me anyway and saying, how do we get everybody back? And so there is some guidance from the Iowa Department of Public Health. We'll walk through that here pretty quickly. There is no mandatory screening. There are a few musts, as I see in the Department of Public Health guideline, and a lot of shoulds and mays. And so I want to kind of highlight the differences here. First, you must observe applicable directives in the proclamations. That means if you're a restaurant, you only have 50% capacity. That means if you're a fitness center, you may have one-on-one appointments only, however that would work. But for a majority of businesses, there aren't those specific directives. So then what? You must follow the reopening guidance. And I'll walk through that here on the next several points. What does that look like? And you will get, we talked about in the promotional materials, a checklist. The links to all of these guidances and updates are in that checklist. As Ann and others have said, this is a bit of a moving target. These are changing. The CDC, I just heard Dr. Birx last night on TV saying she has reviewed edits to the CDC recommendations, and those might be implemented as early as today. So stay tuned. We are all working fast and furiously to absorb and apply this, and it changes, and that's just the way that this is playing out right now. I'd also encourage you to, I'll share my usual daily routine. I get up, I check Iowa Workforce website for the FAQs for workers and employers, because those have been updated. Most recently, May 1st and May 5th, workers and employers respectively. I try to watch the Governor Press Conference at 11 o'clock and check for proclamations. I then will browse over at the Iowa Department of Public Health and the CDC to see if there are any refreshed updates. And so I, take 5 minutes and run through those checks, and then you know that you are on top of things. There have been several occasions where I've been drafting an email in the morning to a client. I go back to finish it after a call interrupts me, and Iowa Workforce has changed its position. So I'm with you. I feel your frustration. We're sick of hearing it, but we really all are in this together. So following the CDC guidance related to cleaning and disinfection, we've heard a bit of some of the best practices recommended already by my colleagues, so I won't go through those again. The reopening guidance encourages Iowa employers to provide supplies for hand washing and sanitizing, reminds you to remind your employees and the public to social distance and to mark your intervals. There's no real enforcement here. You have the ability to implement and enforce that. Nothing changes your right as the employer to set the rules. And if you have public guests, patrons, customers, you can set those rules as well. You're supposed to post signage about who should and should not enter, and the current language is there on your screen now. If they've had symptoms or been around anyone with a confirmed diagnosis, that's the current prohibition on entry. You are supposed to ask employees if they are ill to share that information with management, ask them to leave, and to call their healthcare provider. So very different than mandatory screenings right now here in Iowa. You should consider and have employees consider using face coverings, cloth, or whatever type that is available to them, depending if you're healthcare. Obviously, you're going to have some different mandates there. And so, again, this is really consistent with the theme in Iowa of everyone should make their own best decisions. High-risk folks are still encouraged to stay at home, and right now that high risk is defined as anyone age 65 or older or with serious underlying conditions. And then the last couple of tips on this reopening guidance are that you should follow the Department of Public Health business guidance related to preventing and detecting and reporting outbreaks. And again, there's going to be a link to that in the materials that we'll send out, or you can find that on the website. And that you should use messaging to remind employees of what they should be doing at work. And I've attached just so that you can see what that messaging is. They've got these two posters about social distancing, hand washing, reminding, you know, of all the practices that we've been hearing for the last 6 to 8 weeks here. And so, I mean, those are really all the requirements that are in place for Iowa for re-entering the workforce, because it hasn't really shut down for many, many businesses. And, you know, but that does not say that the practices that my colleagues have just described are things that you should ignore. I think you're not going to be faulted for putting safety first. The last thing that I wanted to note here, most of my questions from Iowa employers are related to unemployment. And again, it is much of a moving target. So check frequently the frequently asked questions portion of the Iowa Workforce webpage. As Ann mentioned just recently, refusing to return to work due to concern or fear, not a quarantine or not some other specific documented reason, will disqualify workers from unemployment under the Iowa program. There is a link, there's a FAQ number 14 on the employer questions. If an employee decides on their own they don't want to come to work or return to work, I mean, yes, that would be considered a voluntary quit, refusal to work, job abandonment, but there's a possibility they could take a position, they qualify for benefits under the Federal Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, PUA, as we describe it. And so, again, that's not your job as the employer to tell the employees what benefits they will get, but I know many of you care or are concerned about your employees. So I would seriously recommend you look at specifically questions 12, 13, and 14 on the Iowa Workforce Employer Guide so that you can advise. And I think that's it for now. We'll move over to North Dakota, and I see we have lots of questions we'll be addressing here shortly. Beth?
Well, good morning. Thank you, everyone, for attending the webinar, and especially for those who have a North Dakota interest, thank you for being here. And as Bridget mentioned, you know, everything that has been stated so far is not mandated in North Dakota. However, these are all, you know, practical considerations that are important to follow. You know, what kind of struck me as interesting is as I was looking at my slides and putting these together, you know, all of this started really on March 13th. So my first thought was, well, what a year these last 2 months have been. So March 13th, we had a executive order from Governor Burgum that declared a state of emergency, and this executive order really only dealt with self-quarantine requirements for people who tested positive, really did not apply to anything in the workplace. So there were a number of restrictions that were put in place. Since then, we've had 39 additional COVID-19 executive orders. So in my slide presentation, I have outlined just the ones that actually have some impact with regard to employment. And I'm not going to go over these in detail in the presentation this morning, but they're here for your reference. But just for a highlight, you know, North Dakota, like Iowa, we didn't have a full shutdown or shelter in place of all businesses. The only businesses that were completely closed down were massage parlors, tattoo parlors, and hair salons. Bars and restaurants were partially closed. They were allowed to do takeout or delivery or curbside pickup only. We did have some executive orders regarding workers' compensation, and also WSI made a determination that being diagnosed with COVID-19 was not going to be a work-related injury that an employee would qualify for benefits under WSI. And the reason for that is they said it was too difficult to prove the causation. of the virus was actually work-related. However, there were some exceptions that were made for emergency personnel, first responders, and funeral home workers and funeral home directors. However, if you review the executive order language, there still is a requirement that they contracted COVID based on their job responsibilities. One other important thing that occurred is there was a suspension of the unemployment tax payments and interest charges for employers. The waiting period for unemployment benefits was waived. There's a 1-week waiting period, which ultimately doesn't affect the amount of benefits that an employee receives. It just affects when they start receiving the benefits. On April 29th is when Governor Burgum issued his North Dakota Smart Restart protocols for businesses returning or to businesses that were continuing their operations. So basically, if you go to the North Dakota government website, there are universal protocols, and then there's the industry-specific protocols. So the industry-specific protocols relate to the industries that were actually impacted and closed. The universal protocols apply to all industries. The universal protocols also contain standard recommendations for all businesses, whether they were closed or not. And primarily the protocols include information that relates to protecting the public. However, there are some employment-specific protocols that are contained within the 2 separate protocols on the North Dakota website. The protocols were put together by the North Dakota Department of Commerce and the state health officer. The other interesting thing is there is a app that's on the North Dakota Department of Health website, and I think it's called a CARE app. And basically, Tim Brookings, who works for Microsoft in North Dakota, developed technology so that when the Bison fans would go from Fargo to Frisco, if you put your information into the app, it would show, quote, the herd moving south to Frisco. And so they've taken that exact same technology, and people individually can put information about themselves in there, and it tracks your activities within the state of North Dakota, and it interfaces with the information that the State Department of Health has with regard to where they're seeing hotspots. So supposedly the information does not provide any specific information on each individual, who you are, and where you live, or any of that kind of information. But if you input your information into the app, and ultimately you're worried about which areas are hotspots within the state for COVID, the app is going to track that information. So the rules and guidelines known as North Dakota Smart Restart. If businesses were closed or partially closed and they adopt and rigorously follow these standard and industry-specific protocols, they may begin to reopen. There is no mandatory language, as I've underlined on my slides. It's highly recommended. I can imagine that if particular industries start seeing flare-ups of individuals with a virus, you may end up with a state intervening and providing some specific requirements or guidelines to a specific business. However, right now they are just strongly recommended guidelines and protocols. And in addition, it's not just the entities that were closed or partially closed. They're recommending that these guidelines and protocols be followed by all businesses. So as part, if you go into the industry standard protocols and then the universal protocols, the universal protocol also has a workplace assessment tool. It's designed to include really all of the 5-star components of a safe workplace plan. Employers are required to complete the assessment to determine which areas they are weak in and maybe need some additional improvement. The workplace assessment plan is 12 pages long, and it's broken down into numerous categories. For example, there's protocols on when employees should stay home, identifying where and how workers might be exposed to COVID-19 at work, monitoring employees for fevers and symptoms, separating sick employees, reducing the spread, determining how you'll operate if absenteeism spikes, making sure you have certain policies and procedures on social distancing, and how to maintain a health work environment. So I think what makes the whole restart complicated is it's not just about trying to implement a new protocol that no one's ever had to deal with in a workplace scenario before, but it also requires you to be knowledgeable and to always keep in mind all the other employment regulations that are out there and how they may be overlapping with what you're initially attempting to do. So as you heard in the previous portion of the presentation, you know, there's all sorts of issues to be concerned about with regard to discrimination or ADA violations or FMLA. So this is just kind of an extension of those cautions of what to think about. So for instance, if employees are standing in line to get their temperatures taken, and these are hourly employees, or they're required to enter information onto questionnaires or into phone apps, you know, that's all work time that needs to be compensated. Also, medical tests under North Dakota have to be paid by the employer if they are required by the employer. And a violation of that statute is an infraction. North Dakota also has a non-discrimination law that says that you can't discriminate against individuals for engaging in lawful activities off-work premises and after work hours if there isn't a specific legitimate business reason for it. You know, so one thing that comes to mind is, let's say, you know, you've recommended that employees socially distance, you know, when they're not at work in order to protect the people who are at work from getting exposed, and you find out that somebody's being very careless or not really implementing some precautionary standards that would be common sense. You know, if you were to take the position that you're going to terminate that person, I'd be a little cautious or hesitant to recommend that you do that because of this statute. The other thing is, you know, in years where we have really low unemployment rates, people, if things don't work out at their job or they get fired, a lot of times they're just more willing to move on and go get a job elsewhere instead of, you know, going through the process of a Department of Labor complaint or bringing litigation. However, with high unemployment rates, you will see employees file more complaints and be more willing to investigate or pursue some type of litigation. The other thing is, if you are doing some kind of testing of employees as they enter the workplace, if you're doing it versus if a third party is doing it, may implicate HIPAA, because HIPAA applies to covered entities, and a covered entity is somebody who's providing preventative or health treatment for an individual. So, you know, HIPAA doesn't typically apply to an employer. The ADA would apply to an employer with regard to whether you can test or what you do with that information. But if you have a third party doing the testing for you, you may end up with a HIPAA consideration. Also, lots of privacy considerations. I know we heard earlier on in the presentation about taking temperatures or, you know, what's being communicated while people are standing in line, you know, waiting to go through the check-in process to start work. Another thing is, if you're asking employees to download information into an app, sometimes these apps may have their own family and healthcare information in there also. And so if the employee is putting information in an app that you have, make sure that it does not have any family information in there, as you might be triggering GINA. Also, remember that although right now we're allowed to test employees, the rationale behind that is because the CDC and you know, the president and all states have declared a national emergency. And so that's where the direct threat component has been met under the ADA in order to test. However, that could change at some point. So always be sensitive to what's going on, and don't just assume that because the EEOC has approved or authorized testing that that's going to go on indefinitely. And also, when you have employees who are hesitant to return to work, you do need to engage in a dialogue to figure out why, because sometimes there is a legitimate ADA, FMLA, some other legally protected right or reason that they're not coming back to work. If they're saying, I don't believe the workplace is safe, OSHA could be triggered, and now you're firing an employee and potentially you have a retaliatory claim on your hands. So very important, engage in a dialogue, find out what the concerns are of the employees before you make any decisions about imposing some discipline. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Being able to ensure that you are creating your return to work plan now, you are analyzing who will return and why, you're complying with the applicable state law, which you have heard differs by state greatly, and you need to be prepared to be nimble and to make your adjustments. You also want to ensure that you are communicating all of the time with your workers. And that, as I thought Bridget's recommendation of checking the various websites every morning and listening to the governor's press reviews are the best way to ensure that you're staying on top of the current recommendations, and make sure that you are promptly responding to any of the confirmed or suspected cases of COVID in the workplace. So with that, we are going to turn to the Q&A, and I am going to try to go through these and pass them along to some of my colleagues as we go here. There were several questions that related to a comment that I made regarding the need to have workers in Minnesota continue to work from home if they can work from home. And that is under the current executive order, which has not changed the requirement that if remote work can be performed, it still must be performed. And there are situations where the employer must determine whether or not there are certain functions that need to be performed in the office versus working remotely. And that gives you the right, if you are in one of the businesses that is permitted to go back to work, that you can. The second component to that is, once those restrictions are lifted and more businesses are permitted to go back, the consideration will be whether or not you continue to have certain workers working remotely so that you can limit the number of people in the workplace. It does not mean that forever you will be required to permit employees to continue to work from home. The final thing I would say on that is that if you have some employees who are in high risk populations and who are asking to continue to be accommodated by working from home, that if you have been able to have them work remotely, that you continue to have them work remotely. All right, so with that, I am going to try to go through these questions. I'm going to address one of the first ones that came in. And Anne, maybe I can toss this to you. It is, how do we address our employees that live with first responders? How do we address high-risk group employees? And who is considered high risk?
So I'll take the first couple there. We should not be treating, in my mind, and I'll let the other panelists, of course, jump in on this. I don't think we should be treating employees differently that live with first responders, healthcare workers, et cetera. or really high-risk group employees. The protocols and processes that Teresa discussed and that Kristin discussed and others have discussed apply to all employees. And my approach to this is we treat everyone the same under these situations. If certain employees that are in high-risk categories have questions, for instance, I have an underlying health condition and you're saying that I'm required to return to work, I'm concerned about being in the workplace, I would follow that analysis that I had kind of outlined. Talk to the employee, talk about the protocols that are in place, understand from the employee what the situation is. We may need to treat it as a reasonable accommodation situation under the ADA. And the high-risk folks are, I believe it's still currently those that are 65 and older. Am I right on that, Teresa? And also those that have underlying health conditions.
That's correct. All right, so Kristin, I'm going to send this one to you because there were a couple of questions relating to health screening, and we talked a little bit about the mass group that is coming back and asking the questions to all of that group, but they're asking whether or not those health screenings, at least in Minnesota, and I think this is limited to Minnesota here, must be done on a daily basis. Do we have Kristin on? All right, I'm not hearing Kristin right away, so I'm going to answer that question. My feeling is that based upon the current governor's order, that the health screening must be done as the employees come into work. So I have been interpreting that as a daily screening, not just something that you do when they first come back to work.
I would agree with that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
Okay. Yes, I would agree with that. And I do think, health situations can change regularly. And so I do think if we're intending to keep sick employees out of the workplace, to conduct daily screening is the right thing to do. And then, I saw some other questions as well about, perhaps leadership did not want to take the temperatures. If that's the case, I still think the questionnaire can be quite effective, asking about what the symptoms are, the symptoms that the CDC and Department of Health have indicated. So if they don't want to use the temperature taking for whatever reason, I still think the daily questionnaire is a good option to screen sick employees. And then obviously to make sure that employees know when they're supposed to stay home and not come to the workplace. And then I know we got some questions on refusal to take a test. If an employee refuses to take the test, what do you do then? And I think what I would recommend on that is to, if they refuse, I would ask why are they refusing? Is it because they're concerned about safety? They don't want to be close to somebody? Is it a confidentiality concern, a privacy concern, or is it they just don't want to participate? I think if it's a safety concern, then I would try to explain the protocols that you've taken to make sure that the way you're administering the test is and that you're keeping someone a certain distance away. If it's a confidentiality concern about if they fill out this questionnaire, they don't want this information to be known by people, then I would just make sure that you understand the steps you're taking to keep the information confidential. And if ultimately the concerns, they're not really giving a valid reason, then I think discipline might be appropriate. But I do believe you should ask the reason for the refusal before you take any disciplinary action.
Great, thank you, Kristin. Bridget, this one I think really gets back to an FFCRA question, and it relates to how do we handle people who do not want to return to work because of childcare issues with school out? Is that one you can answer for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I had a note at the end of my slides to mention the FFCRA because I think you have to look at that as a consideration, even if you have not had employees at work and now they are asking them to come back. While these rights became available April 1st and extend through December 31st, maybe you haven't had any requests for leave under that provision. So let me give you a quick rundown of that. Obviously, hopefully you've all posted the notice, and if you've not had employees on site or occasion to do so, do it now. There's an FFCRA notice to be posted. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act applies to employers with 500 or fewer employees. There is an exception that you can seek, sort of an undue hardship or burden if you have 50 or fewer employees. So if you need assistance with analyzing that, reach out to one of us offline. And then there's also a pretty wide healthcare worker exemption. So hospitals, clinics, dental clinics, first responders, there's a wide array of employees who aren't going to be eligible for this leave because they fall under the healthcare worker category. But all that being said, there is the opportunity for leave under the FFCRA for child care if your school or daycares are closed. We have drafted a request form for leave that, again, contact your usual employment attorney and they can maybe help you tailor that to fit your needs. It requires an employer to provide paid leave at 2/3. There's some limits, but generally it's a 2/3 pay for up to 12 weeks total. This is only for employees who have worked for at least 30 days before their leave request. So I imagine most of the folks that you're returning to work have been employed for that long. But if you were to hire a new batch of employees, they wouldn't be eligible to take this leave until they have worked for at least 30 days. And it's just an extension of the FMLA. So it's an extended family medical leave where if they need to stay home to take care of a child whose school or daycare is closed, can take this leave. So that's one option. There is, it's unclear. The employee, you can require them to certify that no one else is available to care for their child. And so there's not much guidance on how far you can push that issue, how many providers they have to have contacted or anything like that. But, that is one option that's available to employees if they work for a qualifying employer. But other than that, we're all facing that issue, and we all have to figure that out. And if they need to be at work, they need to be at work. If they cannot return to work because of that child care issue, they might be eligible for those federal unemployment benefits, but they're not going to be eligible for unemployment under Iowa, at least, and I'm not sure about the other states.
All right, great. Thank you, Bridget. And Bev, maybe this is one you can touch on. I know it's one that many people gave the thumbs up to. For masks, any advice on handling requests for accommodation, either medically unable, claustrophobic, hot weather makes it difficult to breathe, etc.? And if anybody else wants to weigh in on this, please do. Bev?
Sure. So yeah, if there's, I'll give you my initial thoughts, and then certainly if there's other comments from other panelists. Clearly, if you're requiring the employee to wear a mask and they're refusing to, again, no knee-jerk reactions. You really do have to start asking questions about what, why the employee is refusing to do so. If they have maybe some kind of underlying health condition, difficulty breathing, asthma, or, you know, there's a mental health issue that might be the trigger for why they do not want to wear a mask. That may require an accommodation unless, of course, there's an undue hardship. So definitely ask questions. You know, if you can develop a form that you can provide to the employee to fill out, or use, you know, modify your current ADA form in order to apply to that scenario, that would probably be ideal. Having the communication in writing would be best practices, and of course an open dialogue to ultimately make sure you have all of the facts and information before you make a decision about whether this is a disciplinary issue or whether this is an accommodation requirement.
Wonderful, thank you. Anybody else on that one? I thought that was great.
That was perfect, Bev.
All right, there are a couple of questions in here about in Minnesota that they were an essential service and they didn't actually close, and are they required to put together an emergency preparedness plan? Under the Q&A provided by the state, it makes clear that those critical sectors are not required to have a preparedness plan to continue to operate. However, I have many clients who are putting plans in place to ensure that they are taking into consideration all of the safety protocols. So it need not look exactly like the protocol required for the businesses that are just beginning to open, that are not critical, but it is a good practice. All right. A lot of these we've answered, so I apologize as I work through. And maybe you can answer this one. I talked about conducting training for employees before they return to work. Say it's on a conference call to go over some of the changes. Do we have to pay them for this if it's, for example, 30 minutes or an hour?
Yes, you do. Yes, you would have to pay them for that. That's yeah.
Oh, Kristin, here's one for you. If we require an employee to self-screen and they lie about doing it, can we discipline them?
Yeah, that's a tough one, I think. We've got several questions about self-screening at home. So a couple things. If you self-screen at home and they're non-exempt, I think there is an argument by the employee that they should be paid to complete a questionnaire, to take a temperature, to send in results, that sort of thing. So just be aware of that. The other thing is if you're having them send in results or post results, I get concerned about confidentiality there, because how are they reporting those results? Is the tool secure? Is it truly confidential? So that's something to definitely think about. The Minnesota Department of Economic Security, MNDEED, has a screening tool apparently on their website. We've looked at it, and it apparently allows you to log information confidentially. So I guess that's a potential option, although I'm not real familiar with how it works, how long it takes, and what people's experiences have been with that tool. But as far as the home screening and whether disciplinary action could be taken, I think that could be a difficult thing to prove. If somebody, you know, really didn't do a temperature taking or whatever, I don't know how you would actually prove that they did or did not do it. And I think there's a question too, if someone isn't truthful, that again is going to be difficult, I think, to prove whether or not, you know, they were sick and they said they weren't sick. I mean, that's a tough one. You know, I do think if you have questionnaires, having the employee sign and date the questionnaire is a good idea. But then again, keeping in mind that that information is confidential and needs to be placed in a separate medical file.
All right, thank you, Kristin. And I would only add to that that if you actually have evidence, and I agree with Kristin that it would be very difficult to get that evidence, But if you actually have proof that somebody is lying about their obligations or what they've actually been doing, that you obviously can take disciplinary action if somebody is being untruthful and you can prove it. But we are at our noon hour here. We are going to get a printout of all of these questions in addition to some of those that were provided to us before. And we thank you so much for joining us today. And if we have your contact information, we will try to get back to you on some of the questions that were not answered. And if you do have additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. We are here for you. We've been dealing with these issues for a long time. As you can tell, all of us have really been working hard to get you the information that you need. And the checklist that we provide will have a lot of the links, as Bridget pointed out, to the resources that you can rely upon as you go forward. Again, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you join us for any of our future webinars on return to work. Thank you.